Are we recording? We're recording. Okay, guys, here's the deal. I was made fun of for recording tutorials where I don't start over again or don't edit it when it's not clean. Well, I have a really long tutorial. I'm not going to edit it, so you're just going to have to sit through all my mistakes. Hopefully, I don't make mistakes. Today, we're going to look at a problem that I've been working on for another customer where the goal was to automatically add users to an instance of Domo. That's kind of a lie. We actually have, let's say, 50 or 100 different instances of Domo, and I want my users to be able to just say, hey, I want to add myself to that instance of Domo or another instance of Domo without me having to go through the bulk upload process. If you don't know what bulk upload is, I'll try to remember to link a video in the description below. But if I forget, just ping me and I'll add it as well. I have here a form. And let's say hypothetically you filled out this form. I know email is in here twice. That's obviously a mistake. What time is it now? 8:26. So we're going to call this test 4 at domo.com. And the display name is going to be 8:26. Go to sleep. This is just to help me remember how long it takes me to shoot these videos. All right, we're going to set the user role as privileged. Now, in the text it says, all users will be added as privileged, contact an instant admin for modified rights. That's just a workflow that you could build in. Right now it's just going to add whatever you set it to. Add the user as whatever you set it to. Okay, so I fill out a form. Everybody loves forms. I come into Google Docs, and I can see the row has been edited here, has been added here. Cool. So in a batch, I want to add Eddie Small, test 1, J1, and 8:26 go to sleep. How are we going to do this? We're going to pop into Domo here, and we're going to start by pulling in the Google spreadsheet as a data set using the Google Sheets connector. Obviously, you could use inline editor. You could build a custom app that has this user interface on top of it. Maybe if we were clever, we would figure out how to do this using emails, but I am none of those things. We're just going to use good old-fashioned Google Sheets. Awesome. So now I have 4 rows. It looks like it automatically filtered out the 5th row. That's pretty sweet. Right. How are we going to make this work? Let's jump over into our friend Jupyter Workspaces. Now, I've built this code sample together. It's a little bit sophisticated. We're going to learn a little Python today, so buckle up. In terms of kind of unique packages that I'm using, we're going to be seeing code that's using AIOHTTP and the python.env libraries. All you have to do to install them is pip install, and it will install pretty much any library that you're interested in. Okay, let's think this through. What do we need to do? One, I need to be able to read in my Domo dataset that has my list of users. I need to be able to say, hey, I need a list of roles that exist so that I can map the role that you asked me to add a user to, right? I need to be able to say, what roles exist? What is that role ID? Does this user exist? If they don't, create them. And then once you've created the user or verified that they've exist, assign them to that role. Now this is interesting because right now I'm saying Eddie Small will be set up as an editor. If I look in Domo Dojo, Eddie Small already exists, and Eddie is actually currently set up as a participant. So we're going to see that I can use this script to change the roles that are currently assigned. Fun stuff. All right, first things first. I've done a ton of videos where I talk about how I handle credentials, but I think one of the nicer ways for the time being is to store my username and password in a env file so that I don't have to print it in clear text when I'm doing this tutorial. Now, Domo are going to be launching an update to product, I'm told maybe. that may or may not allow us to access the accounts objects that are stored in the Domo accounts framework, which might be another really slick way to store credentials, but that's not in product yet, but I will let you know as soon as it is. In any event, my credentials are stored in the text file as username equals blah, 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 password equals blah, 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 and then using the Python library load.env, or method load_.env, I can load env.text and then store them as constants. These constants can then be printed. There's my username. There's the instance that I'm going to be hitting. I just have chosen not to show the password. Moving on, working with authentication. Again, I've done videos on authentication. If you have questions about them, go back to them. I've covered them in great detail. I also have a video where I talk about building up asynchronous code using AIO HTTP and async IO. I will not be going into those in depth. Suffice to say, though, that I am going to be using AIO HTTP's client session to send my requests instead of the standard requests in Domo, because eventually I might choose to make this code run asynchronously. If you understand what I meant, great. If you don't understand it, that's okay too. This code base will be made available online. I'll be happy to share this code in the dojo. Let's talk about classes. If you haven't worked with classes before, classes are a very powerful way of saying, I have this object, and I want this object to have these properties, and I also want to be able to call this method for this class. What do I mean by that? Let's say hypothetically I had two instances of Domo. Maybe I have an instance called Domo Dojo, and I had another instance called, let's just call it Domo, right? And I have a username and a password associated with both, and I want to be able to do some sort of automation against both, which requires me to have a session token for both. Now, I could sit down and say, requests.get blah, 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 and fill out the form, as it were, for how I request a session token for Domo and a separate session token for Domo Dojo. But if I have a class that has that method predefined, what this opens up to me is I can say, hey, I have a Domo Dojo full auth object. It's going to be based off of the Domo full auth class, and I'm going to pass in Domo username is that constant that I saved earlier. Domo password equals the password that I saved earlier, remembering to use commas, and Domo instance is equal to Domo instance. Right? We've used libraries, we've used functions before. This is kind of the same thing. And what don't you like? You don't like the minus. Okay, so I have a variable or an instance of the Domo full auth now called Domo auth, and I can print it. When I print it, you'll see that it displays the username that I passed in and the property Domo instance. But curiously, it does not print the password that I passed in. And that's because data classes allow me to say, hey, I want to have this field or this property called Domo's password, but I don't want it to be part of the representation. REPR stands for representation. What that means is that when I print the object, it doesn't show the password, which is, of course, the whole thing behind security, right? I don't want to just print my password in clear text. So I'm just choosing to disable that from the representation. And I do the same for token. Now, I haven't asked for a token yet. We haven't dealt with the token. But now that I have Domo auth, which is an instance of the full auth class, I can call the method get auth token. Now, get auth token does not accept any parameters other than itself. So it passes the Domo auth with these properties into the get auth token method. And what is it going to do? It's going to call session.request. It's going to call a post request against this URL. It says, hey, self, I want you to use the property Domo instance that we passed in earlier. I want you to use the self.username and self.password that we passed in earlier as part of the body that I'm going to send to this API. Now, once I get a response, if my response has the session token property and it is a success, then I'm going to add the session token to self.token. So I'm going to add that property to the Domo auth object. If I run get auth token, it says, hey, coroutine, blah, 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 blah. What's a coroutine? Again, check out my asynchronous videos. Coroutine basically is what you get before you await a asynchronous request. It's basically saying, hey, I spat in a placeholder for an answer that I'm going to get eventually. If you want your code to wait until you got the answer, you have to await. I know that makes absolutely no sense, but again, watch my tutorials. So now that I've awaited the response from getAuthToken, it's saying, hey, this asynchronous function, wait till it's done doing its magic, and then do something. In our case, token received is part of the text of the printout of this method, so I actually don't see anything yet. If I want to see the token, I would have to print Domo auth.token. Because remember, token is not part of the default representation. So I've set it up so that I can't see it, but it is in fact there after I run the getAuthToken method. Again, what's cool about this is I could have 1, 10, or 50 different Domo instances, but all I have to do is create a new object, let's say Domo auth2, and maybe pass in a different Domo instance, and the appropriate username and passwords. Now I can have 50 different full auth objects, and all I have to do is call the same function, getAuthToken, to get tokens from each of those, as opposed to having to write out this code many, many times. So the short version of the story is using classes allows you to recycle your code and basically just keep a cleaner library of code. That, of course, is how the whole concept of a software development kit, that's how the Java CLI works, right? We don't know what's going on under the covers. We just call a method like add user, and then Domo does, or the CLI does some magic under the covers to hit the right API and do the stuff. But our job is very easy because it's kind of parameterized and simple. So that was our really quick introduction to classes. If this is confusing, take the time to learn it. Classes will really accelerate the speed at which you can write code and the quality of code that you're producing. For us, I have what I actually am going to be using is a Domo full auth instance of the full auth class called full auth. That was not English, but it's been a minute. We've been working. All right. Next thing we need to do, right, we have handled authentication. Let's talk about how we're going to get data from that config data set. If you'll recall, in the data center, I have a data set called config add users. To add that to my Jupyter workspace, just go to the workspace, go here over to the wrench, edit it, and you can add input data sets. You can add any data set from the data center and make it available to your Jupyter Notebook. The way you're going to access it is with the import Domo Jupyter library. We're going to alias it as Domo. We're going to use the read data frame method. We're going to say, hey, this is the data set that I want to access, which if I've set up myself up correctly over here on the left, I can see all of my input data sets. I'm going to access config add users, and I'm going to run this query. just to kind of see it from scratch, if I just do select star from table, it will be exactly as the data right? It would have all of my columns, timestamp, email address, email, display name, and user role with a space. I don't want user role with a space or display name with a space because that's too much extra typing. So I'm going to modify my query to alias display name and alias the user role. And then I have a cleaner data frame to work with. I think this is probably one of the coolest features of Domo Jupyter Notebooks is to be able to query Adrenaline using SQL and then to be able to mash it up and work with it in Python. If you're not a Python guy, that's okay, or Python person, that's okay. Give it a couple weeks. You can do some really powerful stuff in here. All right, so these are the four users that I want to add to Domo and set their roles. So let's talk about roles. Once again, I'm going to add a data class called Domo role. It will have the properties full auth, ID, and name. Now, here I can have the methods that I'm able to call. I have two methods. I have an add users method, and I have an underscore membership add user method. Now, from the naming convention side to your methods, you can pretty much call them whatever you want, but anytime you have a method that starts with an underscore, it usually means that it's private. Your end users are not supposed to touch it, but these private methods are used or accessed in other methods. To access a method in another method, I pass in self, which of course refers to the instance of the Domo role. And then I can say, hey, self.method. Okay. Now you're probably wondering, hey Jay, why do you have an add users and an add user? Like what's going on there? What I'm choosing to do here is I'm choosing to separate what my code does into two different methods. This will be what the users call. They'll say, hey, I want to pass in a list of users. I want to pass in the full auth object, and I want you, code, to magically add users to Domo. Now, we all know that, well, if you don't know, you should. If you use a private or a undocumented API from Domo can change it at any point. That's the whole reason why they call them undocumented. That's the whole reason why they discourage the use of these undocumented APIs. But realistically, we also know that the undocumented APIs are the ones that do all the cool stuff, so we have to use them. By having a separate sub function, if you will, what this allows me to do is if Domo changes from v1 to v2, I can very quickly, copy this method here, make a new method called v2, swap out, the parameters that I need to pass, and then the only thing I have to change in kind of this wrapper function, if you will, is I would just say, oh, just kidding, we're now using v2. And I can change it at will. I can test it kind of separately without having a huge impact on the function that the rest of my user base kind of interacts with. Another way of thinking about this is, right, we know that we have public, or we have the documented APIs, and we have undocumented APIs. And those APIs will use a different auth object. So maybe I'm going to extend my library to say, hey, you get the choice to use full auth workflow, or maybe you have a developer auth workflow. And if you pass in a developer auth token, then my code has to behave a different way. So I might say if full auth, then we're going to call the method that uses full auth. Otherwise, we're going to call the method self.membership add members public API, right? We might have a separate method that we call when you're using the client ID and secret authentication method. Those are two reasons why we might separate the function that I expose to my end users versus the functions that actually go ahead and hit the APIs. That's just how I chose to implement my code. Do you have to do it this way? No, it does create a little bit more typing, but I think this is, again, for more extensible code. Did I undo all of the changes? Just change. I think so. Okay. Things to see here. What are we doing? We have a put method. We're passing in Domo authentication from the full auth token. And again, all I'm doing in this method up here is I'm just returning a true or a false if I successfully add a user to this role. Are we talking about roles? We are talking about roles. Good. Before I demonstrate the code working, let's quickly take a look at Domo user. Again, it's another data class. Again, we have these properties. We choose to hide full auth from representation when I print the Domo user class. And again, I have two separate methods, the private create user method and the public create user method that I actually want you to use. A lot of times, if I'm going to use something special with the response after I call create user, I would do it in the wrapper function. I think we're going to see an example of that very shortly. So, if I know the role ID, I can do stuff. If I know the user ID, I can do stuff. But what if I need to like search for a list of all of my users, or search for users by email, or get a list of all of my roles? I have a third and final class for that, which I'm calling instance config. This is just a name I kind of plucked out of the air. It is a data class, and it has a property roles, which will be a list of the Domo role class. How does that work? Well, when you call get roles, you're going to get a response. You're going to get a JSON list or a list of JSON objects back. That's what happens when you request get role with the underscore. If you call the public or the exposed method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, after I get a list of JSON back, I'm going to turn that list into a list of Domo roles. No, I said roles way too many times. That's probably confusing, so let's just see it in action. I'm going to create a variable, let's call it instance roles, and I'm going to say instance config. I'm going to call the private get roles method. I'll pass in full auth equals full auth. And we're going to print instance roles. And I need to await the response. Cool. Why are you giving me heartache? Here we go. So you can see here this is the classic response I would expect back from an API. I expect back a list of dictionaries, a list of the roles. But these roles can't do anything. There's no methods associated with them. I can't just say .add user to this role, to a role, because it's just a dictionary. But if I hit my public method, what get roles will do is it will take this list of objects here, and for each role object in that list, we're going to return a Domo role class based off of the ID and name. So let me see here. We're no longer using underscore get roles. We're using get roles. So now the response is a lot more simplified, but it is actually an instance of the Domo role class. What does that mean? It means I can say instance roles 0 to get the, let's print this. Let's print the type. I think I can do, is it type or instance of? I forget. It says the type of this list item is Domo role. And if I go ahead and print it, I can see, okay, Domo role, admin. But what that means is I can run the function, sorry, the method add users. I could say add users, and if I knew a user ID, I could add that user to this role by just calling the add user method. Again, it allows me to have more simplified code when I adopt classes. All right. Another classic example of why you might choose to use hidden methods is, let's think about searching. I would love to be able to just call a method called search users by email. I just want to be able to pass in an email and it searches Domo and says, here's the user that matches this email. That's what I want to have happen. But what information do I need to send to the API? Well, I need to pass it a specific body that does the searching. And that body is generated by a hidden method, this generate search users by body by email. I have to pass in filters, text, field is address, and then the address value. I would never know that. I would never be able to guess that. But because I have a method that wraps all of this, it just kind of does it for me. If I wanted to search by display name, I guess maybe it's set the field to display name, but I would never remember all of this other stuff around it. So again, having these kind of wrapper methods inside a class just really lets you have recyclable code. And when Domo changes the way the API works, I just change the wrapper function. Sorry, I create a new hidden function, change where the wrapper is pointing, and we're off to the races. In any event, you'll notice I'm going to hit the search users method, but I'm just going to pass how I search by email. In terms of the response in the exposed method, I'm saying here. Did my microphone stop? It sure did. Okay, we're back. What was I saying? Yes. For the list of users that I get back from search users, I want to only keep the user whose email address matches the email that I sent into the function. And that's the user object, right? That's just going to be a JSON object. But I don't want a JSON object. I want an instance of the Domo user class. So what I'll return is my Domo user, where I pass in the stuff from the JSON object. And now I will have an instance of the Domo user. So let's see. Yeah, I will run over the instance config object or class. I will search users by email, and then I'm going to search for j@onyxreporting.com. And let's print that out. That will give me an instance of the Domo user class. Now, what can I do with this class object? Well, all of the things that I defined up here under Domo user. Well, I can create a user, but if I wanted to be able to change their name, share content with them, right, I could just add more methods here. All right. I know this tutorial is getting long, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of it all. I'm going to start at the end. For each row in my user data frame, for this row here, what do I need to do? I need to find out the ID of this role. And if this role doesn't exist, theoretically, I want to make a role with that name. Then I want to say, hey, is Eddie.small@domo.com already a member of my Domo instance? If they are, I want to change their role. If they are not, I need to create a new user. Okay, how do I handle that when I process a row? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a function called getRole that does what it sounds on the tin, finds the role that I want. So what is getRole doing? GetRole goes to my instance config, gets a list of all of the roles. It tries to find a role that has the same name. If I do not have that role, I just have a placeholder here that we need to create the role. If I do have the role, then I just return it. So we're good. Now that I have the role, I'm going to go ahead and create the user. So again, I have a method called getUser. What is that going to do? Sorry, I have a function. Let me use the right words. I have a function called getUser. The getUser function, again, is going to search instance config by email and try to find that user. If the user does not exist, I need to create them. I need to add them to Domo, which is the whole point of this tutorial, right? So what will I do? I will call the createUser class method of Domo user. I will pass in the display name, the email, and the role, and I will get a Domo user back, which I then return. So if for whatever reason I'm not able to create a Domo user, then it should error out and return none. I think this bit of error handling is broken, so egg on my face. I'm not good at my job. Yeah, if not create, then here, yeah. Yeah, I think this bit of error handling doesn't work as expected, but that's okay. The code and at the end of the day will run. Okay, so now I have a user, and now I have a role. The last thing I need to do is, right, if I have a user, I just need to add them to that role, right? If Eddie Small is currently a social user, I need to upgrade him to editor. If Eddie Small is an admin, I need to set him back to editor, right? So I just need to update their roles. And to do that, I'll call the method addUsers to the Domo role that I identified earlier. Super, like, all of this, how do I build a class? How do I define the full auth, right? All of that stuff we don't worry about. What I really like about using classes is I can hand somebody a library that has all of these classes predefined, and then the integration effort is so much easier for them. The functions that they have to write, they don't have to know the API, they don't need to know the body, they can just call methods that get the stuff done. Okay. If add user to role is a success, then print success, otherwise print fail, and then we should have some sort of failure handling. All right, this is a moment of truth. I'm going to go ahead and clear my kernel, clear all of my outputs, and we're going to restart and run it from the top. Please work the first time. 33 minutes in, and we all want to go to sleep. Did it fail already? It did, damn it. What are we doing here? Oh, this is pseudocode. Start over again. Oh no! Why do I still have this V2 stuff we were talking about? There is no V2. That was just talking about how I might have if I had a different API. Okay, here we go. So for each user, we started by saying, hey, Eddie Small, they're a match, and we're going to add them to the editor role. Test1 wasn't part of the instance, so I needed to add them. Like I said, this error handling is suspect. Let's see if test 1, 3, and 4 exist, and let's see if Eddie's role is now set to editor. So, admin, people, let's go find our friend Eddie. Eddie is an editor. And what about test 1? Test 1 is also an editor. What about test 2? No. What did I create? Test 4, 826, go to sleep. 4, 826, go to sleep. It works. The code works. It does what it's supposed to do. For grins, I'm just going to mess some things up. No, actually, I'm not. I lied. The theory is, and this is the whole reason why I did this, if you want to be added to the Domo Dojo, I'll post a link to the Google form. Go ahead and fill it out. And then, now how do I just automatically get it to add you? That's the last piece of the puzzle. One of the features of the Jupyter Notebooks that I think is actually the best part about it is that I can now go into a notebook. Sorry, I shouldn't have exited the workspace yet. I can go into a notebook. I can click on the little data flow button here, and I can set this up as a data flow that executes every day at 8 p.m. or, whatever schedule we want. Which means I can go into my data center now, and I should have a data flow called Jupyter. Good stuff. Click on it. Now it will behave just like any other data flow. It is set to run on that schedule that we defined earlier. Now what is weird is it says it doesn't have any inputs, which is obviously not true. We have it set with these inputs. But just for grins, let's set ourselves up. Test 6 at domo.com. What time is it? It is 9:02. Oh my gosh. And we're going to set them up as privileged. Okay. We can see that new entry here. We need to go into the data set and trigger it to update. Because I currently only have 4 rows, I need to have that new 5th row. There we go. Test 6 has been added. And then I'm going to take my notebook and tell it to run. Now, with all of the other data flows we could trigger them to update when a data set updates, but this part of the Domo user interface isn't quite there yet. So that triggering currently can only be set to trigger, hourly or whatever the schedule is set in the data flows. But let's see if it did what it was supposed to do. Let's go into admins. Let's go into people. What do I call them? Test 6? 9:02. No, really. Go to bed. It works. Guys, that was the whole tutorial. I hope you found it useful. What did we do? We took Google Forms, pulled it into Domo, pulled it into Jupyter Notebook. We learned how to build classes to kind of write cleaner code. We talked about private methods versus public methods and having slightly more efficient code in the Python we're writing. And then we just saw this automation work. I will include a link so that you can add yourselves to the Domo Dojo. If you want to get access to my code sample, hit me up in the Slack user group, which I will also link in the tutorial. But otherwise, have a great night, and I'll catch you guys later.